big. We talked about God cares about small, that God wants to connect with you. And now we're talking about God has a plan, because we've got a bit of a problem. Amanda, can you tell us about a bit of a problem?
Well, sometimes really small things can cause us a lot of trouble, can't they? Really small things. Well, one day when we were living back in Sydney and the boys were going to a VBS in a holiday, just before the VBS, they all headed out to play a game of, was it mini golf? Mini golf, that's right, mini golf. And the mini golf was a little bit sort of in the countryish area. There was a few trees and that hanging around and hanging over the mini golf area. So the children had a great time. James must have been about 4, I think, at the time. So he wasn't quite old enough to go to the full VBS, but he was able to go to the pre-VBS program. And anyway, we'd registered the boys to go. And the next morning, after they'd played mini golf, we took them along. But James wasn't looking very well. He's feeling very hot and flushed and bothered. So I said, oh, well, maybe you'll just have to miss today. So he didn't go. By the middle of the afternoon, he'd started throwing up and his temperature was getting higher and higher. And I thought perhaps he had caught some kind of virus or something like that because he was most unwell. And I said, oh, well, it's time to go and pick your brothers up from the VBS. You'll just have to bring a bucket in the car. You know what that's like. You have to pick the children up. And it doesn't matter that someone else is sick. You can't leave them at home by themselves. So you strap them in, give them a nice big bucket and say, make sure it ends up in there, buddy, because we don't want to clean it up off the floor in the car. So he sat there looking very upset. And we go and pick up the boys, come back home, and he's just not getting any better. By the next morning, we took the other boys to the VBS, and I thought there must be something. So I made an appointment with the doctor, and I couldn't get it until that afternoon. I thought, this is really bad. Anyway, I noticed on his shoulder there was something that I hadn't seen there before, and I thought, that looks very strange. And I took a closer look, and I don't know if you can see it on here. Well, you probably can't. There was this tiny, tiny little thing. You can come and have a look afterwards if you like on the card there. It's tiny. It's got to be smaller than a pinhead. And I thought, what is that? And I come from New Zealand, and we don't have things like that here. But it turned out that it was a tiny, tiny tick. And it was just sitting there on his shoulder. And I hadn't seen these things before, and I thought, that's not supposed to be there. So I rang Brendan, who was at work, and I said, I think James has got one of these tick things. And I said, I don't know how to get them off. And he said, I'll smother it in butter. But I thought, well, Vaseline should do. So I smothered it all in Vaseline, and I thought, I left it for a little while, and they said, you know, you Google things. Get out a credit card and scrape it off. Well, I had an ABC rewards card. Not Adventist Book Centre, but the other one. And I tried to scrape it off, and it wouldn't come off, and it wouldn't come off. And I thought, better leave it there a bit longer. And then finally, I did one last scrape as I was starting to panic, because I didn't know how badly these affected children. And I heard this popping sound, and the whole tick came out. And if you look at it under a bit of a microscope or a magnifying glass, you can see all the tiny little legs. And it was this tiny, tiny little tick that was making James so sick. And about 30 minutes later, he was fine. And I couldn't believe that something so small could cause so much trouble.
Something so small can cause so much trouble. Sometimes you think sin, it doesn't matter. It's just a little thing. I'll just cheat a little bit. It won't matter if I'm mean to somebody. But it can, like a little tick, it can be a problem. But God has a way to solve the problem. He says, John 3:16. Yeah. So God says, I've got a plan to fix that problem. And I've got a plan to get rid of sin. And just like we brought back a cat from the pound, God says, I will come and Jesus will die for you. And then it says he's going to grow us. Ben, have you got a story about how God grows us and how he works in and through us to make fruits of the Spirit and love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control? I'll hold your mic because you don't have a stand.
All right.
And Brad, we'll talk about that another day. I was going to talk about those things, but we'll talk about it another day. I'm just trying to pass this off to Brad, but he can't see what I'm trying to pass him. There you go.
Once there was a beautiful grapevine, and on that vine lived a branch named Basil. Basil looked at his leaf. Oh, wait. Yeah, there's no picture there. Basil looked at his leaf and said, "What a lovely, luscious leaf." He twirled his tendrils. What terrific, trendy tendrils. And he gazed at his grapes. What giant, juicy grapes. Basil was a happy branch. Suddenly a dark shadow fell, and there stood the gardener, and in the gardener's hand, "No, no, not the secateurs." "Ah," cried Basil. "Snip." Basil slowly opened his eyes. He was still alive. He looked at his lovely, luscious leaf. It was gone. "I've been pruned," groaned Basil. But Basil was not one to let things get him down. "Well, at least I still have my terrific tendy tendrils and my giant juicy grapes," he said. And then the dark shadow fell, and there stood the gardener, and in the gardener's hand, "No, no, not the secateurs." "Ah," cried Basil. "Snip." Basil opened his eyes. He was still alive. He tried to twirl his terrific trendy tendrils. They were gone. "I've been pruned," groaned Basil. But Basil refused to let things get him down. "Well, at least I still have my giant juicy grapes," he said. But then the dark shadow fell, and there stood the gardener, and in the gardener's hand, "No, no, not the secateurs." "Ah," cried Basil. "Snip." Basil opened his eyes and gazed where his giant juicy grapes had been. They were gone. "I've been pruned," groaned Basil. Basil was down. Then Basil heard a voice. "Hi, Basil." He looked up, and he saw a grapevine, and on the grapevine's face was a big smile. "Basil, I am the vine, and you are the branch. The gardener prunes every branch that has grapes, so that next summer they'll produce even more grapes." "Ah," sighed Basil. And sure enough, the next summer came. Basil found that he had a new, lovely, luscious leaf, more terrific, trendy tendrils, and a beautiful bunch of giant, juicy grapes.
So, when we connect with the vine in John 15, then God works in and through us to produce fruits and love and joy and peace and patience and kindness, goodness, faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. And God has a way that he died for us to fix the sin problem, but then he has a way when we connect with him, he makes really good fruits come through us, hey? Now, I was going to tell you a story about lizards, but that's going to wait for another time. Next time we have a camp, we'll have to come back and tell some more stories. Because right now I want to tell you our pioneer story before we head off to our Sabbath schools. This is number 4 in our series, but you'll be a bit excited about number 5. Because number 5 is the Tasmanian story that's this afternoon. So this afternoon we're going to talk about the Tasmanian book. But this one, has anyone ever been to Mildura? You have. It's an amazing place, eh? I grew up in Mildura. But if you're out at Red Cliffs, near Mildura, you're going to see, does anyone know what it's called? Big Lizzie. Big Lizzie is a huge, big tractor that sits out at Red Cliffs, and today it sits by the road. It's all restored, and it's monstrous, absolutely monstrous. But let me tell you about Big Lizzie. Well, first of all, let me tell you about Frank. Frank Bottrell is his name, and Frank was working up in the mines in Broken Hill. He was an engineer up there, and he watched all the camels coming in with all the wool and the wheat and everything. He thought, poor camels, there's got to be a better way than this. If I can get a traction engine up here, then we can bring the wool and the wheat in, save those camels going over the sandhills. Good idea? Well, Frank got his traction engine and he was going from Morgan in South Australia to Broken Hill. No roads, going over sandhills, and his traction engine got bogged. Now, in actual fact, the traction engine's still out there. And out in the sandhills, out near Morgan, the sand blows across, and sometimes the sandhills blow away and you can see Frank's engine still out there because he walked away sad, left his engine. What a failure. Some of you know Bubbles and Andrew, because Bubbles used to come to camp and do the meals here. Andrew was very excited about trying to go and find that engine, by the way. But Frank thought there's got to be a better way. So he designed these wheels. And these wheels, and there's a name for them, Amanda? What's the name of these wheels? Dreadnought? Dreadnought wheels. And what they do is they lay their own tracks as they go. So he thought of these wheels because he was an engineer. And then he went back to Melbourne. Now, in Melbourne, he went to a program run by Robert Hare. Do you remember Robert Hare? That was the bloke from yesterday's story. Robert was the guy whose brother had the typewriter. And so Robert was in Ballarat running a program, and Frank went to the program. And Frank became a Seventh-day Adventist. Not only did he become a Seventh-day Adventist, there was a lovely Bible worker at the program. Her name was Margaret. And so Frank thought he needed some Bible studies, and he thought he needed a girlfriend, and Frank married Margaret. So boys, when you grow up, don't use those apps. You go to the evangelistic program. Always the best option. Absolutely. And he got to work on his big Lizzie. He was an engineer living in Richmond, by the way. That's where we know the first evidence turned up. So Frank's at his engineering spot in Richmond, making this massive, big traction engine. Now, the traction engine only went at, 3 kilometres an hour today. And so it's a very slow, big engine. He had 2 big trailers on his engine. Apparently he had a 3rd trailer, but at one stage he crashed over a bridge, and so he left it behind to turn into a bridge. And he made his big traction engine. Can you imagine clomping out of his engineering works in Richmond, and it clomped down Punt Road, and it clomped along Sydney Road, and it crashed and boomed and laying metal tracks as it went. It must have been quite a sight. And out he went. He was going to cross the river at Echuca and head up to Broken Hill. So slowly he made his way. He knocked out a bridge at Seymour as well. It was too fat for the bridge, but anyway, and there's a big dent on a tank that's still there to this day that happened at that spot. Finally got to Echuca to cross the river. And guess what they said? You're not going to cross the river here, Frank. You're going to wreck our bridge. Our bridge is too small for your big engine. So poor old Frankie wasn't going to get to Broken Hill that way, so he clomped along in his big traction engine all the way to Swan Hill. He gets to Swan Hill. That bridge was too small. You'd think an engineer would have thought of this. Anyway, what did he do next? He clomped along to get to Mildura. He gets to Mildura, and there was a flood, and the punt wasn't running, and Frank couldn't get his engine, his big traction engine, his big Lizzie, he couldn't get it to Broken Hill. What he ended up doing, and everyone thought, this guy, what a strange fellow coming out here with this great big tractor. But it worked out good in a way, because when the government started bringing soldiers back from the war, they wanted some land cleared at Redcliffs. They wanted the land cleared for farms. What are they going to do to clear land for farms? There's a big engine hanging around our town. And so Frank got his big engine, and instead of carting wheat from Broken Hill, he just was clearing land. But guess what he did on Sabbaths? He stopped his big tractor, and all the farmers were like, why doesn't he work today? And Frank would tell them about the Sabbath, and he would run Sabbath school and church worship services on his big Lizzie. And the farmers, there's nothing else to do there. They would come and listen to him. And Frank would preach them a sermon, and Margaret preached a sermon. And they had a dog, by the way. Was it, do you know their dog's name? No, but the dog was a vegetarian, we know that. Poor old dog. I think he probably ran out and found some rabbits somewhere, but poor old dog. Anyway, so they would have worship services on the traction engine, and people think, we've never heard this stuff before. We've never heard about the Sabbath. We've never heard all these wonderful things about Jesus coming back. And they would listen to Frank, and Frank would go from town to town clearing spots. And Frank did some interesting things. Frank started churches. And this is the Mildura church that Frank and Margaret, they got that started, and Frank was pretty good at building things. He'd already built a big engine, so Frank would help build churches. And they got a guy out there, Walter Scraggs Sr., came out and run their first evangelism campaign. Do you remember him? He was the little boy that got saved in the other story. And so they ran a campaign, and they started the Mildura church. Oh, but his engine, they'd finished the clearing of the land, and Frank and Margaret walked away from the engine. They thought, what a failure, what a dismal thing this was. And it got left to go to ruin at Glendenning until later on a historical society got to and fixed it up. But then they started the Dearton Church, and this is a painting from an actual photo of Margaret putting the first brick in the Dearton Church, which is the church I grew up in, by the way. And so Frank and Margaret, they did a lot of amazing things in northwest Victoria telling people about Jesus. So, was Frank's engine a failure? Well, it was as far as getting to Broken Hill. But here's the thing. Sometimes we make all our plans, but guess who's in charge? It's where it talks about the man makes plans in his heart, but the Lord directs it his way. What an amazing thing. This engine wasn't a failure because this engine was the spot where churches got started on. And what didn't get to Broken Hill got to places in little towns in Victoria where churches ended up being because God used Frank and God used Margaret and God used a great big traction engine. And so today, if you ever drive to Mildura on the Calder Highway, when you get to Redcliffs, make sure you stop. You'll see it. You can't miss it. It's huge by the road. And you can have a look at this amazing big tractor. But think if we've got an amazing big God who can use our ideas and even sometimes our failing ideas for his glory. Let me say a prayer for you and I'll let you off to Sabbath school. Dear Lord, we thank you for another day and we thank you for your guidance and blessing. We thank you for people like Frank and Margaret who did all sorts of wonderful things and spent their Sabbaths telling people about you. And we ask for your guidance and blessing today in our Sabbath schools. May we learn things about you that grow the fruits of the Spirit in our lives. May you work in and through us. Amen.